Uh, my name is Peter Fever. Welcome to this event. I'm a political science professor and the director of American Grand Strategy. And before I introduce our distinguished guests, I just want to note that uh, there is, of course, a horrible tragedy that's befallen America. I'm referring to the murder of Charlie Kirk yesterday. That's not what this event will be about, but tomorrow at noon, the Civil Discourse Project is hosting a drop-in time to discuss that event. And that'll be tomorrow at noon down here in Sanford '09. And then in a couple weeks, next week or the week after, there'll be a larger panel of reflections on that and what it means and what this moment means for American politics. And it's a profound moment. So I hope you all will come to that, but that's not what this event is about. But of course, you're a leading figure as well. So I just want to give you a chance if you wanted to say something.
Political violence is always wrong. It's how democracies die.
No. This wasn't scheduled for this, but September 11th is also a anniversary of another horrible moment in American history, 24 years ago today. And that featured more prominently in your career. So that we might begin by talking about 9/11. Kori is a distinguished national security expert, one of the most distinguished we've got going. A dear friend, I won't say an old friend because you're young, and haven't aged a bit over the many decades that we have known each other. But it's fair to say that you had a wonderful career before 9/11, but then 9/11 shaped and changed the trajectory. So maybe, Kori, just reflect a little bit about 9/11 and what that meant.
Sure. So on September 11th, 2001, I was actually giving a talk in Brussels to a European audience about how the world still felt very dangerous to the United States in a way it didn't after the end of the Cold War to Europeans. And I, of course, had no idea how consequentially true that would prove. But I was there with my brother, who was an Air Force colonel stationed at Schake, the NATO headquarters. And we were on a train going down to Mons, and someone came up to us crying. Someone who was not an American came up to us crying to say they were so sorry for what happened. And I think about that. I'm sorry. I think about that when I think about September 11th a lot, because it means a lot that America behaved in the world in a way that people grieved with us at that time. And that's a very great blessing that we should take better care to husband than we do.
You went on to work in the Bush White House, in the Director for Defense Policy and Arms Control. And then from there, I won't detail all of your career. Now,
I can't hold a job is like take away from this.
Now you have the very solemn responsibility of hiring Duke AGS alums. You have quite a few on your staff, and AEI, where you now are a leader, has been very, very good to Duke AGS over the years. Thank you for
Duke has been very good to us.
Yes, and so if you're thinking about that, get her email and please connect with her. You've also written widely. You've written some great. You're actually one of the best and fastest writers in the business.
So he says this because he was once my editor at Foreign Policy, and almost every editorial interchange was Peter saying, "I think it's a good article, but I would advise you not to publish it."
There were a couple of those, yes, but mostly I was like, "Thank you. No one else could write something that good that fast." You have a great chapter on the grand strategy of Tecumseh, which, if you haven't read this, you should read it because it's brilliant. But that's not what you're here to do. You finally, after meandering in the backwaters of American grand strategy, you finally found the most important central topic, which is American civil military relations. And so you are here to show your forthcoming book, which is a very important book. It's called The State and the Soldier. If you work in civil military relations, you're only allowed to use 3 words, and you have to rejumble those words in titles. You're stuck with that. You come up with a new one. The State and the Soldier, A History of Civil Military Relations in the United States. It's coming out 26th October, available for pre-order now. Why did you write this book? What was the hole that you were seeking to fill?
So I'm what passes for an expert on civil military relations because I've done a lot of work on it over the years. I went to work in the Joint Staff at General Powell's invitation when I was a 26-year-old PhD student. And I spent 6 years in the Pentagon then and do a lot of work on the intersection of policy and military strategy. But I had actually never read Sam Huntington's Soldier in the State. And when I did, I was outraged that we allowed this to be the foundation of the field, because Huntington's conclusion is that an effective military is incompatible with democracy in America, and therefore America needs to change. And which I think fundamentally misunderstands the relationship between the military and society. And so inspired me, in addition to wanting to write a Jeremiah about Huntington, to want to tell the story of how is it that a country founded in fear of a standing army has come to think of our military as a major bulwark of democracy. It's not obvious. And the second thing that inspired me to write the book is that it's really quite extraordinary and historically anomalous that a country that has a military so powerful, so proficient, so influential in policymaking has not once in 250 years had the experience of a coup attempt or an attempt at state capture by that military. It's a precious and unique history that the US has. And so I wanted to tell the story about how that happened. So I start with George Washington and work forward to talk about the platform.
How much credit does George Washington deserve? I mean, many of the treatments would sort of say we were blessed to have him because he set the perfect model. Is that your read of it?
So I don't think he set the perfect model, but I do think we would have a very different history if George Washington hadn't been commanding the Revolutionary War Army and hadn't been president as the norms and institutions of the relationship between the American military and its public were being settled and established. Can I tell the Newburgh conspiracy
Yes,
story?
yes.
Okay, so
Then I stop you from talking.
So one thing I should have said at the start, the burden I have suffered under my entire career is being 2 years behind Peter Fever in graduate school, because everybody always compares me negatively to all of Peter's great achievements. So you will hear an undercurrent of resentment throughout this, and it's just decades in the making, my friends.
And it's just pandering to the audience, I'm pointing out, because they love that kind of thing. So,
So the Newburgh conspiracy. So Washington, part of the reason he is so good and so valuable as an exemplar of civil military relations is because he's a politician before he's a soldier. He's 7 years in the Burgesses of Virginia. And that persuades him to a fundamental subordination of the military to the civilian power. That is Washington's great contribution. He never demands of the Continental Congress. He implores, he pleads, he tries to show them how bad things are, but he fundamentally accepts that subordination. And it becomes clear, even it perks through in strategy, right? The first couple of years of the war, Washington's trying to impress the British. He writes these war plans that are so much more complicated than his army can actually execute. And he gets saved by what we describe as mission command, right? He surrounded himself with all these young sparklers, Lafayette, Hamilton, Nathaniel Greene, Daniel Morgan, and they know enough to understand what he's trying to do and go find a way to do it rather than follow his plan. And when Greene tries to persuade him that as long as we have an army in the field, we have a revolution. Washington views a Jacobin strategy, so strike and retreat, don't leave an army that can be conquered. Washington calls that an extended form of cowardice. But after the battle for Brooklyn Heights, where he nearly loses his army, he allows himself to be persuaded. And this is the second important point about Washington. It is the politicians with the political commitment, the objectives, and the resources that they commit that determine the strategy, right? Again, that's a very important example. And you can see how significant it still is, because if you look at public polling, like the polling Peter does so adroitly, of American public attitudes, they don't blame the military for losing wars. They blame the political leadership, and they're right to do so in most cases. But the most glittering moment of Washington's leadership, and the example that resonates most for me, is what's called the Newburgh Conspiracy. So in 1783, is that right? 2 years after the British surrender at Yorktown, the Revolutionary Army is encamped in Newburgh, New York. And they are there because the British are still in possession of Manhattan while the peace talks are going on. Washington has had to hang 2 soldiers that were demanding provisions. They had, not only have they not been paid, they have been fed. And so, you know, there's a lot of unrest. Alexander Hamilton, then in the Continental Congress, gets the idea that you can use the military to politically pressure Congress into voting themselves revenue powers. That's what he's after. He's after federal authority to raise revenue. But he encourages Washington to have his army march on the Continental Congress in Philadelphia and demand their pay and pensions. Washington famously responds to Hamilton: an army is a very dangerous instrument to play with. And then the way the army tells the story is a very sentimental telling of it, which it's the endearing characteristic of the American army, this earnestness. They tell the story that he stumbles on this mutiny of junior officers and he fumbles putting his glasses on and says, "I feel old and nearly blind in service of the country." And they're so ashamed of themselves that it disciplines them. And it is true that he does say that, but I think it's much more for political effect. And that telling of the story overlooks the 2 important examples Washington sets. The first is, this is a good order and discipline. He stations 6'4", 260-pound Major General Henry Knox at the door to take into custody for court-martialing anybody who won't sign an oath of allegiance to the Continental Congress. And the second great thing he does is the way he diffuses the mutiny is to call them to a higher purpose, right? That we should want to be the first military in 1,000 years that isn't a threat to democracy. That's what disciplines him. And by the way, he's got a written speech because the Congress rushes it into print and it's circulated all over the country almost immediately. So it's not that Washington's not political. What makes him successful is that he is political, but it is the institution supporting subordination of the military to civilian control that is how he exercised the politics that made for such a fabulous example.
When folks tell the history of American Civ Mill, they they lean heavily on the fact that never been a coup, never really a serious coup attempt. There's been rumblings, the Newberg conspiracy is one of them, but that's a pretty enviable record. So one way is you look back and you say, wow, we have a lot to be proud of. But when you get into the details, you look a little closer, it's a messier history. I'm curious, what were some of the messes that you found that surprised you, if you knew about, you only knew about, at a certain level, and once you dug into it, you realized this is an interesting story.
Yeah, so the chapter 2 of the book is the rogues gallery of efforts by, in particular, charismatic, successful military operators to subvert political control. And there are a bunch of them, right? But the one that sticks with me most is I was shocked to realize that the first American president to vet military officers by their political party. Anybody care to guess who it was? Go.
Abraham Lincoln?
Good guess, but wrong. Anybody else?
Later or earlier?
Just guess. Okay, I'll tell you. Thomas Jefferson.
He had good reason to, though. So,
well,
in his mind, what was he afraid of?
What he was afraid of was that most of the leadership of the military were George Washington's heirs. They were all Federalists. And so he cashiered them and instead put in charge of the Army General James Wilkinson, who was a Spanish agent the entire 12 years. He was the senior officer in the Army. He was integral not just to the Aaron Burr plot, but to Burr's trial also. It was said of James Wilkinson, he never won a battle or lost a court-martial because he was court-martialed several times. The most difficult to adjudicate case for me, and I want your verdict after I tell the story. The most difficult case to adjudicate is Ulysses Grant in 1866 and 1867, where just before Lincoln was assassinated, before the election in 1864, Lincoln goes to City Point, meets with Grant, Sherman, and DuPont of Farragut. I can never remember who the admiral is who's present. And, say again?
Porter.
David Porter?
David Porter.
David Porter. Thank you, John. And Lincoln outlines his plan for Reconstruction. And it's incredibly generous towards the Confederates because what Lincoln wants is to mold the Union back together. Lincoln's assassinated, and Lincoln wants them to end the war before the election because, great politician that he was, he could see the sweep of radical Republicans winning the election, which they do in 1864. Lincoln's assassinated, Andrew Johnson becomes president, and vacillates between initially being incredibly vituperative towards the Confederacy and then quickly switching sides. And that's the cause for his impeachment by the Congress. The back and forth is Johnson tries to veto the 3 Reconstruction bills that Congress passes. He works against the passage of the 14th, 15th, and 16th Amendments. Congress impeaches him. He wants to put in to the Department of War as somebody opposed to Reconstruction. Congress passes legislation making it illegal for the president to fire either Secretary of War Stanton or General Grant. Johnson fires Stanton anyway, and is threatening to disband Congress and have members of Congress arrested. Congress is threatening to have the sitting president of the United States arrested, and Grant gets thrust into the middle of this. And Johnson appoints him Secretary of War coterminous with being General of the Army. Grant agrees, I think, simply trying to buy time for the politicians to solve this constitutional crisis. And Congress threatens Grant with 5 years in prison and a $10,000 fine unless he relinquishes the Secretary of War position. So Grant is put in a position, I think, no senior military officer ever had, being forced to choose between the two constitutional sources of civilian authority. And Grant's decision in 1867 is that in peacetime, Congress has the superior over the president in control of the American military. Now, it's for me a hard one to adjudicate because in fact, Grant's loyalty was to the dead president's policy, not the sitting president's policy. And that is a civil military violation. He was actively working against the president of the United States' policy. And in doing so, I think when the military moves into protecting the republic from the idiot politicians we elect, that subverts the proper order of civil military. Moreover, it gets in the way of the civilian responsibilities and authorities from working as they should. That said, I mean, it's Grant and it's Johnson. And so I think Grant was in error to do what he did, although I'm quite sympathetic to what he did. How would you grade him? Peter?
Well, the only thing I would add is it seems almost quaint nowadays to imagine a Congress that vigorous in defending its Article 1 responsibilities. And I would say that whenever the military is caught between, and there have been other instances between a Congress and a president fighting, that's when it's the hardest for them to do their job because they literally are children of divorced parents from parents fighting, usually through the military,
Yes.
competing. So I didn't expect to spend so much time in the 19th century because I wanted to argue with you about Mark Milley. We may have to.
You notice he's not answering the question.
Yeah. Yeah, I would side with Grant. I would side with Grant because of Johnson's error. But I would agree that it's a violation. So Civ Mill can survive these venal sins. We've had many, many venal sins. It's the mortal sin that we can't, the Republic can't survive. Do you want to say anything about the 20th century Civ Mill crisis before we get into the 21st century, which is when you were writing this and really is the ghost that's haunting all of what the Bill Poll book.
Yeah. So in the 20th century, there were two charismatic senior military leaders who attempted to put their judgment above the president of the United States judgment. The first and little known is Admiral William Sims, who was commanding American maritime forces in Europe during World War I and was an enemy of Woodrow Wilson and overtly disobeyed Wilson's order that American forces would be associated but not allied with the European powers. He subordinated the American Navy command to the Royal Navy, Britain's leadership. And how Wilson and the Secretary of War solved this problem was to send an admiral senior to Sims instead of court-martialing Sims, which they didn't want to do. They didn't want to make him a martyr, and they didn't want to do it in the middle of a war that wasn't all that popular. And remember, Wilson in 2016 had run on the platform of keeping America out of the war. So they just sent a superior admiral over his head to reverse his orders. But so there's William Sims, and then of course there's the canonical case, which is Douglas MacArthur. My favorite moment from MacArthur firing is how how much responsibility Omar Bradley, who was then the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, took for the circumstances. Bradley wasn't sure that MacArthur should have been fired because Bradley felt the chiefs had not been clear enough in their direction to MacArthur. The written documents, I think, make a stronger case than for Truman's choice. And of course, Truman won the political argument, which is what most politicians do. But what is so interesting in both of those cases was Sims actually had a lot of support in the Uniform Navy and wrote a condemnatory book. But the mistake he made was claiming that Woodrow Wilson's strategy for the war had produced more American casualties than the United States actually took in the war. And so he discredited his own campaign, but a lot of the Navy leadership was behind him because they were fighting the post-war fight about budgets and strategies. Whereas MacArthur had virtually no support in the military leadership. And I think you and I differ somewhat over George Marshall, but Marshall was newly Secretary of Defense, and I think he should have been handling this problem instead of kicking it upstairs to the
Yeah,
president.
he was the lion in winter at this point. Great hero, but probably not at his peak. The one thing to point out, because the audience may not know this, MacArthur had no support among, or little support among the military, mainly because he was pretty arrogant and had pissed off everyone else. He had enormous support among Republicans and in the American people. Can you talk a little bit about that? It was not a foregone conclusion that in a toe-to-toe political fight, the American people would side with the unpopular president instead of the war hero.
Yeah, and MacArthur was overtly playing politics. So instead of sending his updates on the war to the president, he sent them to the Republican Speaker of the House of Representatives to be read on the Congress floor. But you know, Truman was unpopular, but he was a bare-knuckled politician, and the way he handled it, I mean, he gives an interview in which he actually says that he didn't fire MacArthur because he was a dumb bastard, because if he did that, he'd have to fire 2/3 of the generals in the army. He fired him for being insubordinate to the president. Like, he knew how to play the politics of it. Also, Republicans, I mean, the Korean War was a really partisan war. And the public understood that Republicans were, for the first time in living memory, playing domestic politics while the country was at war. So I think that helped.
Okay, while you're writing this book, America is going through its own contemporary civil crisis of sorts. So that's really the ghost haunting this. Talk about that crisis and where you, or those challenges anyway, and where you come down on that.
So I think there are three major challenges. The first is the increasing polarization of American politics, right? Because our military is organic to our society. We will not long retain an apolitical military if civilians keep putting this kind of pressure on the military to politicize. You know, Senator Tuberville held up and eventually quashed the assignment of a 3-star Army general who had commanded the 101st Airborne, because that officer had carried out the legal order from President Biden to vaccinate troops of the division. That's going to fracture the unity of our military if politicians keep doing stuff like this. So I think that's the first element of the crisis. The second element of the crisis is the rather clumsy way some military leaders have stumbled into opening the aperture for greater politicization. And I'm pretty critical in the book and in life of General Milley for the way he did that. And the example that I think is most illustrative is the testimony he gave about critical race theory. So it's a budget hearing. The Secretary of Defense got asked about critical race theory and gave a perfectly good, respectable answer, which is, we don't teach it. It's obscure law, like it's not part of the American military. And unbidden, General Milley could not resist the temptation to show off his Princeton education and gave a long disquisition about books he's read that didn't make it Marxist, and et cetera, et cetera. Okay, when judges go up for confirmation, they always get asked, was Brown versus Board of Education properly decided? Because it's the easiest proper decision probably the court's ever made. Charlie, correct me if I'm, or at least keep me honest. But if you answer that, you have to answer, was Roe versus Wade properly decided? And that's why nobody will answer the question about Brown versus Board of Education. General Milley actually has a legal advisor as chairman who could have told him, don't answer the question, and probably did tell him, don't answer the question. But he stumbled into it, and now every two-star going up for confirmation has to answer that question. So I don't think it was
What
malice.
question? Just
The question of, is critical race theory, what is your view on DEI issues, all that kind of stuff. Again, it wasn't malice of intent on his part, but by being so clumsy and not thinking about the damage he was doing institutionally, I think he and some others genuinely have. And then, of course, the third and the major element is the arsonist in chief. I mean, the norms are eroding, as your work has shown for a couple of decades here, right? Politicians are using uniformed military in ads. President Biden gave a speech about the collapse of democracy with 2 uniformed Marines standing behind him.
Well, it's worse than that. It wasn't just collapse of democracy, how Republicans are collapsing democracy. Yeah.
But President Trump is not just different in degree, he's different in type on that. At current count, 14 senior officers have been relieved of command with no explanation. So he's sending a message into the military leadership that nobody's safe, right? There's no basis on which you are being relieved, you're just being relieved. The firing of the judge advocates general, I think, is the most dangerous because he's sending the message he wants more permissive interpretations of the law. And I think some of the debate we are having and will have about the strike on the boat in the Gulf of Mexico, I think, is the result of that. He's holding political rallies in front of troops, encouraging those troops to criticize other elected politicians. All of that stuff is actually really bad and shouldn't be done by anybody.
So let's dig into that. You mentioned the strike against the Venezuela, the boat coming from Venezuela. Because last week we had General Brown, and I was asking him what's the military role, and I think it's fair to say he was careful in his response. And I told some of the people, I said, next week I'll ask Kori. She will not be careful. So I put the same question to you. What would you have had General Kane do? Or if you had 10 minutes with General Kane, what would you tell him? General Kane being the current chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff.
So I reject your structure of the question because the civil military problems we are having are not the result of our military.
Okay.
This is the behavior of the civilians, and and our system has only civilian solutions to this problem, right?
Explain that.
Yeah. So going back to Grant, right? Our system is structured that we don't want the military saving the republic. Not only can it not save the republic, you're not going to like the republic you have if the military is in charge of it. We have civilian solutions to this. My advice to General Kane would have been lawful but awful is still lawful. And if it's lawful, you only have two choices. You either resign your commission or you salute and carry out the policy to the best of your ability. That's the box the military's in. So if the lawyers say this is legal to do, you actually don't want a military where Sergeant Schake is deciding she thinks this is a bad idea for the country. You can't have a cohesive fighting force if that's the case. The advice I would have given General Kane is study Colin Powell's relationship with Congress, because the solution to the problem, many of the political problems we are having in our precious country right now, is Congress failing to carry out its Article 1 responsibilities. And so Congress, we often say that Congress, that nobody declares war anymore. But Congress, during the quasi-war with France in the 1790s, actually gave a limited authorization for the use of force. And Congress should be raising holy hell that President Trump didn't come to them for that. So that's the solution to this problem, that you should have to win the political argument over the use of force in advance of the use of force.
Well, you said if it's lawful but awful, but I've read now a number of articles from respected lawyers, some of whom who held very senior posts in the Biden or Obama administration, say this is not even a close call. It's obviously unlawful. I think Charlie Raderman, right? Or
That's what was.
yes.
Oh.
Okay. Yeah, no, I know.
Policy. There would be.
Okay, so there are lawyers out there who are telling the military, this is so obviously unlawful. This is what the lawyers are saying. This is what these lawyers are saying, that there must be some other explanation for why you're carrying out these orders, because they're manifestly illegal and you have a duty not to carry it. So now I put the question back to you. General Kane is hearing these voices say you just carried out something that was manifestly illegal.
General Kane is not accountable to lawyers writing in the New York Times. He's accountable to the lawyer whose job it is to tell him whether something's legal or illegal. And I cannot imagine, not just General Kane, but I can't imagine the top 4,000 officers in the American military agreeing to carry out that operation unless the controlling legal authority said this is legal. Now, that lawyer ought to be dragged up in front of Congress and made to explain herself or himself and that ought to be publicly disputed. It ought to be transparency, ought to be forced, accountability ought to be forced. But the military is not the villain in this, and they can't save us from bad policy by people we elect. They just don't have the latitude to fix that problem for us.
Well, President Trump and the people around him say that General Milley thought it was his job to save the country, and that a number of people around President Trump have accused General Milley, who was then chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, of undermining him in the end days of 2020. And you might go further and say everything we've seen since in Trump 2.0 is the administration, in their mind, quote unquote, correcting for this phenomenon. Is that a fair description of Milley's behavior in the end of 2020? And
no, I don't think it's a fair. I don't think it's a fair charge to lay on General Milley. Although I will say, him saying stuff like, I need to land the plane safely, gives them a fair amount of newsprint. on that. General Milley was mostly, swaggering around, talking to his own guys about what he was doing and backgrounding journalists on it. That would, a lot of General Milley's problems are General Milley's own creation. But what the president is doing is not only disgraceful, it's
Doing now.
dangerous. Yeah, what he is doing to General Milley, and not just General Milley, to Jim Mattis, to Mark Esper, to people who were Trump appointees. Remember, Milley gets his job because he goes over to the White House as the nominee to be the SACIR and emerges as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff 6 months before General Dunford's term is over. So, he gets bit by a snake he let loose in the garden, but
He was Trump's guy, is what you're saying.
yeah, but none
bit.
of that justifies the way the president, the Secretary of Defense, I mean, really, you're going to take his portrait down out of the hallway? That stupid, petty, venal kind of stuff should be beneath us. And it's getting dangerous, my friends. It should stop.
Why is it dangerous?
It's dangerous. I mean, because it raises the political temperature and encourages political violence of the kind you saw in Utah just yesterday.
Let me,
It's of a piece with encouraging people to take violent action against people who had served in the Trump administration before.
let me ask my last question, then I'll.
And oh, by the way, the president also removed the security detail for those people. So this is dangerous, and it's going to get more dangerous if we don't stop this kind of stuff.
Let me ask one last question that's right now with civil military concerns, and that is the deployment of the National Guard in cities in DC, LA, imminently perhaps in Chicago. Is this a civil military problem? And if so, what should be done about it?
So truth in advertising, I should admit, I am advising the Attorney General of Illinois about their legal case should National Guard troops be deployed in Chicago. People join the National Guard to help the country fight its wars and to help their fellow Americans in disasters. And I worry that the very aggressive effort by President Trump and the people around him to associate our military with a fictitious argument that there's an emergency that needs the potential for violence to repress it. I really worry what that's going to do to the relationship between the American public and our military. I think, first of all, I dispute the president's claim of emergency powers on a whole range of fronts, but in particular, the president's got two choices for the use of the National Guard. Three choices. You can either declare an insurrection is occurring and use and deploy National Guard to quell the insurrection. You can federalize a state's National Guard for federal purposes, either fighting a war or domestic policing, if you invoke the Insurrection Act. Or you can use what are called Title 32 authorities, in which a governor loans their National Guard to the federal government. But in that case, one state's National Guard cannot be deployed to another state unless the governor of the other state asks for it and approves it. So the way the White House is talking is, we're going to take Texas National Guard and we're going to send them to Chicago and fight crime. The problem is, crime is actually not a federal authority. It's a state and local authority. And you can't send National Guard troops from Texas someplace else unless the governor of that someplace else. So I really wish I didn't have to be an expert on National Guard authorities, and I really wish none of us had to be, because I think it's actually not the reason National Guards, people, men and women join the National Guard. I think it's going to have a detrimental effect. We're already seeing it in Washington, where I live, where somebody leaked the internal National Guard assessment about how much the public resents the Guard being in DC and how much the Guardsmen themselves hate the doing of it, even before they're collecting trash and spreading garbage.
Was it you who came up with the term, they're the National Gardeners now and not the National Gardeners?
I wish.
Yes. Okay, I want to take questions. You've got the mic, so raise your hand. While you're waiting to raise your hand, okay, in the back, while you're going up there, let me tell you about some upcoming events. Since we're doing a Gettysburg staff ride and the applications for that close tomorrow night, you recommend doing a staff ride?
It's great.
Yes.
Go see Buford on Seminary Ridge. She's the very best of them all.
And then next Wednesday at 9 a.m. in the Sanford Circle there, a meet and greet with our military fellows who are here doing their senior service equivalent. These are senior military officers who have about 15, 20 years experience, a lot of combat experience. You can grill them on Kori's answers and see if they agree. Said no. Great opportunity to meet some of your colleagues. And then on the 25th, so 2 weeks from today, we have Rachel Myron, and she will be presenting her own book launch. So it's a lot for you to look for. I hope to see you all at that. But first, second.
Perfect. Speaking of grilling, as we were talking about General MacArthur, as you were all talking about General MacArthur, I believe you mentioned you have a disagreement in interpretation with Professor Fever over George Marshall when he was defense secretary. Can you elaborate on what that is and your side of this?
I told you.
That's to you.
No, I want to hear you. What?
So where Peter and I disagree is that I think the comedy, the pleasantness, the problem solving, the smoothness of civil military relations during World War II is quite remarkable, given the policy differences that the military had with President Roosevelt. And when Peter read the manuscript of the book, he objected that there was a lot more friction than I'm giving credit for.
Yes, that we didn't have a coup, but we had enormous inter-service rivalry problems, lots of misbehavior, including, I think MacArthur's behavior in the Southwest was almost worse in the Philippines than it was in Korea, because he was actively flirting with running for president against Roosevelt, and his campaign was going to be Roosevelt's killing Americans by not giving me enough ships and enough air. And that was going to talk about a toxic civil crisis. So it was a lot messier in World War II. And Marshall's genius was that he kept all that from completely blowing up. So I give him a lot of credit for it. But
You
I
don't
think it
give
was
Leahy enough credit for it, though.
yeah.
He's even more important than Marshall
Yeah,
in that.
fair. He had good leadership at the top, but they were managing really serious tensions below and throughout. And Marshall was arguing with Roosevelt in a way that is hard to imagine happening, say, today. That there's a level of interchange there, that a trust relationship. So that's the good news. They were able to establish trust relationships, but if you just did a transcription of it and played it out, boy.
So I end the book with my advice to military friends about how to navigate this difficult moment. And the most important piece of advice I offer is to pass the Marshall test, because Marshall disagreed with the president on quite a number of things. And the reason that Peter's mistaken and there wasn't very much tension is because George Marshall never thought his judgment should supersede the president's judgment, right? But the president gets elected to aggregate societal preferences. And Marshall always deferred to the president's right to do that.
Marshall did, however, though, ask the president, would you please stop using the word we when referring to the Navy and they when referring to the U.S. Army? He was frustrated by Roosevelt's pro-Navy principle. Okay.
Hey, good evening, ma'am. You talk kind of about this tension between the military and the current administration today. How would you suggest that the officers and enlisted of the current military deal with it? Like, what did they do to grapple with, orders they may be given that could be controversial?
And maybe also talk about your views on the Fort Bragg, the behavior of the troops in Fort Bragg, if you want to. That's a good.
Yeah. So I think there's not a whole lot the military can do. And the solution actually is in the civilians. What I think the military, both enlisted and senior, is doing really well is trying to keep their foot out of the wolf trap, right? They are not running on the sidelines close to running afoul. I mean, if you watch General Kane at the press conference, at any press conference, the one that particularly I think is significant is the one after the strike on Iran, where the president had said they completely destroyed it, and Secretary Hegseth was doing informative push-ups. General Kane gave the military intelligence assessment and kept his mouth shut otherwise. He didn't correct what the secretary and president said. That's not his job. It's his job to inform the American public about what the military knows and what the military did. And I think that's exactly the way to do it. But there may be no successful strategy for dealing with the Trump administration. I mean, and that's the nature of this system, which is that the president can fire anybody he wants. That's one important test of the system. The other important test of the system is, will the military carry out policies they don't agree with? And I think the American military clearly passes both of those tests. But what the president's doing is squandering an enormous amount of high-priced talent that we taxpayers invested in. I mean, just coloring inside the lines and trying to keep yourself out of the social media fracas is about the best I can advise.
Thanks for your time tonight. You opened by describing the arc of American military civil relations as kind of a remarkable one or a unique one. I'd be curious to know how you understand the Civil War itself in that context, not just what came after with Grant and Johnson, but wartime.
Yes, so that's a great question. Thank you. So there are, let's see, two Civil War Union generals in the Civil War who campaigned for president while on active duty against President Lincoln while the war is on. Right, McClellan gets removed from command, but he's still an active duty Army general when he is running for president against President Lincoln. And Fremont is every bit as bad. And actually puts Lincoln in a very difficult position because when Fremont is military governor of Missouri, he nearly precipitates the secession of the border states of Kentucky and Missouri by emancipating Black slaves in the state as a military measure. And Lincoln has to walk that back. That's Fremont trying to position himself as the premier abolitionist to run for president. So one of the reasons that the exchanges between Lincoln and Grant are so endearing was Lincoln was so grateful that Grant wasn't one of those guys. And Grant was so grateful that Lincoln was clear about what the objectives were and let him do his job. The real civil military infractions of the Civil War are by Robert E. Lee and the Confederates who resigned their commissions and take up military roles in the Confederacy. Because it was well known at the time, in a way that has faded from our discourse over the subsequent 150 years. The reason the American military takes its oath to the Constitution was precisely to prevent what Robert E. Lee and the others did, right? The section in the Constitution that talks about military oaths is in the Supremacy Clause section. And it's there precise in the debates over the Constitution. The Federalists and Anti-Federalists are arguing about this because people worried that military officers would put loyalty to their state over loyalty to the union. And so, you know, this was still living history at the time this is being adjudicated. So that's the major civil military infraction of the war.
Hi, first of all, thank you so much for coming. You've talked a lot about the balance of power and like the separation between the military and the presidency. And I'm just curious, kind of in line of that idea of separate balances of power, how do you think the Supreme Court has changed recently, and in the last few years? And what do you think of their new immigration ruling?
So I can give you one taxpayer's opinion on that subject, but I am not an expert on the Supreme Court or on immigration policy. So you have one California voter telling you that looks to me like the Supreme Court is making decisions to try and force political accountability back into the political system. That's how I view the overturning of Roe versus Wade. That this is a political question that the political branches of government ought to actually sort out. And I hope that continues to be what governs them. On immigration policy, man, immigration is the superpower of this nation. And I really worry that the behavior of the administration in trying to accomplish the completely justifiable control over the southern border is actually going to destroy one of the things that has been most integral to making this country great.
I'll stand up. Hi, my name is Will Beckham. I'm a first-year MPP student and also an active duty Army officer. So a question I get asked a lot by my neighbors and family is, what's the name of the base that you're at again? Is it Fort Bragg, or did they change it back again, or what's it called now? And I was curious, as someone who was on the renaming commission, what would you advise a future president about what direction those the names of those bases should go?
The renaming of the bases is, for me, a perfect example of lawful but awful. Okay? So I was on the commission that did that base renaming. What the law requires is the removal of Confederate names from facilities. Would anybody care to guess how many real property items in the United States military inventory had in 2020 been named for Confederates? 10,000.
Wow.
10,000 bases, ships, community centers, roads, right? Like, so all that was required was the removal of the Confederate and being renamed to something else. So the secretary is completely within his power to do the petty, venal, vindictive thing of naming Fort Bragg for some random dude who was named Bragg. What the commission tried to do, and I think succeeded at, was identify Americans that we wanted soldiers to emulate. And so we tried to prioritize naming for Medal of Honor recipients from enlisted ranks in particular. So not generals, but somebody soldiers could actually relate to better, and from more recent wars. And so it makes me sad that they are doing that, but they are within their authorities to do it. It's just one more way that the politicization is perking in, like the culture wars are perking into it. But the Pentagon's never been from culture wars. It's just tiresome.
Hello, thank you for coming today to speak to us. I had a question about, you mentioned that there's current political polarization and there's been an increase in political violence. What do you think the government should do to address this issue? Do you think the problem is the leadership, the change in leadership, or do you think more external factors like economic factors and immigration? I think it's more of a broader problem.
So immigration is definitely not the cause of political violence in the United States. I mean, not at least since Sacco and Vanzetti days. It's actual Americans who are the problem. And I don't actually think government can solve this problem. Another of the superpowers of American society is civil society. And all of us can actually do a lot in the way we behave, in the media we support, in the way we react to crises. So I would encourage you not to expect the government to solve this problem for you, because they are derivative of the culture that's driving the polarization.
Last question.
Hi, thank you for coming. Are you concerned about the impartiality of the JAG Corps? And do you think there should be a broader structural change to expand protections for their independence?
So my general belief is you could fire the top several hundred American military experts in any field and you would still have really good work done. So no, I'm not particularly concerned. But I think actually the only bulwark we have at the moment against politicization of the military is the professionalization of people in uniform. And I think they're coming through with maybe one or two exceptions with flying colors. But I still want to know who agreed on that strike on the speedboat in the Gulf of Mexico. I want that gal dragged in front of Congress to explain herself.
So I hope Kori has whetted your appetite to do two things. One, to go order the book so that you can read it. And then say, man, I really would like to dig into this for an entire course of study. Because in the spring, General C.T. Brown and I are co-teaching American Civ Mill. We will require, of course,
Okay,
her
do
book.
not miss this opportunity to learn from those two.
And we'll dig into every one of these questions. But for now, it remains just to thank Kori for getting us started in this. Thank you.